SNP spokesman Patrick Grady.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's a pleasure to follow the member for Norwich North, not least because she was at the time the Minister that brought in the Elections Act that has given rise to the motion today. The Minister on the front bench, whom I hold in the greatest of regard, is a slightly lost count. I think either the fifth or the sixth Minister from the second Government department that's had responsibility for manifestations of that Act, whether it was the bill proceedings or delegated legislation since its first reading in 2021. And that really doesn't say much for the continuity of this Government or its commitment to getting the regulation of elections right. And perhaps that's largely a surprise. And in fact, as I alluded to, I think much of the statement and much of what we're doing today is actually a hangover from a slightly different era and more muscular era of the Conservative Government. And it's a pity because the Elections Act, on one hand, was a massive missed opportunity to properly consolidate and update electoral law for the next quarter of the 21st century. And on the other hand, it actually provided for significant regression in the access to and potential fairness of UK-wide elections and certain other elections in England and Wales. It removed proportionality from mayoral elections. It imposed the burden of photo identification, particularly in poorer and marginalised communities, and at the same time extended the franchise to millions of voters from overseas with much less in the way of verification. And now, on the floor of the House today, the cherry on the top, the crowning glory of this Government's interventions on our election process, a strategy and policy statement for the Electoral Commission, a body that is supposed to be the independent regulator of elections across these islands, a body which already has extremely clear functions set out on a statutory basis in the Political Parties Elections and Referendums Act 2000. And that's perhaps my first question to the Minister. What is this statement? Is it the law? Is it a statutory instrument? Is it delegated legislation? I think it's quite telling, Madam Deputy Speaker, that the Government has tabled it for debate in the Chamber rather than passing it to a DL committee. And I have a feeling, because I have a feeling that was its original intention, and I have a feeling the Minister would have rather preferred that in terms of the scrutiny and publicity that he's now facing. But here we are. Here we are in the Chamber, because I'm not entirely sure if a motion to approve a strategy and policy statement is actually delegated legislation. It seems as if the Electoral Commission is not legally bound to follow the strategy and policy, only to have regard to it. But as others have asked, what does that mean? What happens if the Commission finds itself in conflict between the statement and the statute? Can it be challenged in the courts? And if so, by whom? By political parties? By non-party campaigners? By the Government itself? And if it's not the law, how is it to be enforced? Who decides if the Commission is compliant or not? Now, I know the Minister and you, Madam Deputy Speaker, enjoy some deftly deployed Latin, so perhaps it's a good time to ask the classical question, qui custodiet ipsos custodes? Who watches the watchers? Or in this case, who commissions the commissioners? Well, the answer to that question is it's this House. It's Parliament that recommends commissioners for appointment by the monarch by means of an humble address. It was Parliament that established the Commission in the first place by the 2000 Act. The Commission is accountable to the Speaker's Committee of members of this House, and through other mechanisms to the Parliaments of Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. So perhaps we can look at the statement and the motion before us and ask, is the Government usurping the sovereignty of this House? Because the motion is unamendable, much as some of us would have liked to amend it to mandate the Government to abandon the statement and indeed repeal the relevant section of the Act, and the statement itself is unamendable. The Government ran a very limited consultation, limited in time and limited in the number of consultees. So where is the parliamentary sovereignty in that? The only way that the Scottish Government was able to express its views was in a letter from my good friend, the Minister for Parliamentary Business, George Adam MSP, to the Levelling Up Housing and Communities Committee of the House. But then that's probably a pretty fair reflection of what this Government thinks the place of Scotland's Parliament and Government is in the modern United Kingdom, a subsidiary of the Housing Committee of the House of Commons. The statement doesn't have any effect on the Electoral Commission's functions in the devolved nations. But by definition, that increases divergence of practice, which is perhaps a surprise given the UK Government's determination to promote the broad shoulders of the Union. In his letter, Minister Adam makes clear that, like almost every other stakeholder, in fact every other voice we've heard today, with the exception on the Government benches, who has taken an interest in this matter, that he considers the strategy and policy statement to be an unwelcome and unnecessary interference with the independence of the Electoral Commission. And he also makes the extremely valid point that the statement's preamble says that it does not suggest that the Commission should cease to carry out any of its other statutory duties. But he therefore suggests quite rightly that this appears to raise the alarming prospect that such a suggestion might feature in future versions of the SPS. But surely a change in the functions of the Electoral Commission would require a change in the statute. So it would be helpful to hear the Minister's response to those points, because it gets to the heart of what this statement is or is not supposed to achieve. If it is largely a restatement of the principles and functions that the Commission is already carrying out, as the Minister sought to assure us in his most emollient tones, then it seems to me to be surplus to requirements. So perhaps the Minister could give us some examples of what he thinks that the Commission will do differently or better than it is currently doing as a result of the statement. And if the statement is simply changing the emphasis on certain functions, then it goes back to the point I raised in my intervention. Why is that necessary? What does he think the Commission is doing wrong? And why does the Government need to direct what is supposed to be an independent regulator? The reality is, of course, that the Elections Act was just one piece in the pernicious series of steps that this government in its different incarnations has taken to shield itself from accountability and reduce the openness and transparency of democracy across the UK. The Dissolution and Calling of Parliaments Act, which restored the prerogative of calling an election to the Prime Minister alone, with all the consequences that that's having for the Tory backbenches and the press gallery and the podcast studios of Westminster. The Police, Crime and Sentencing and Courts Act, which has restricted the right to protest. And the UK Internal Market Act and sundry other pieces of legislation arising from Brexit, which have ridden roughshod over the Sewell Convention and deliberately weakened and undermined the devolution settlement. So perhaps it shouldn't be a surprise that the government has the independent regulator of elections in its next sights. The Conservative Party is clearly not going to have an easy time at the next election, and it has clearly decided that therefore neither should anybody else. If they're a candidate, a political party, a non-party campaigner, an electoral registration officer, a returning officer or some other official, or indeed the Electoral Commission itself. The time to introduce elections legislation reform is usually at the beginning of a parliament, so that everybody involved has time to prepare and implement the changes, not at the desperate fag end of a session as part of what appears to be a scorched earth policy by the current government. And that does mean, though, that there are some serious questions for the official opposition and all of us writing manifestos. Are the official opposition prepared to repeal or amend aspects of the Elections Act, should they have the opportunity to do so at some point in the future? Will they commit to getting rid of the statement and certainly not publish any of their own? In the meantime, Madam Deputy Speaker, the Government needs to hear from the House that this statement is at best unnecessary and at worst, which I think is more likely, an undermining of the independence of the Electoral Commission and indeed its accountability to this House rather than to the Government of the day. Members of government benches, wherever they are, because they're clearly not that interested in this, who believe far more fervently in parliamentary sovereignty than those of us who believe in popular sovereignty do, should consider whether this really is the road that they want to go down. And if they don't, they should join those of us who respect the independence of the Electoral Commission and who want to see fairness and transparency across elections in these islands in voting against this statement, whatever it is, this afternoon.